Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking to a new generation of rail historian. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 45 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today's episode, we are talking to two of the folks at Garbely Publishing, Rudy Garbely, who is the founder, and Richie King, who is the author of the Rahway Valley Histories Volume 1 and 2. A Shortline railroad in New Jersey that Richie felt compelled to write about. We're talking to both of them about what it means to be entering the print world in the 21st century and what that means for rail preservation. What was nifty about this interview as well is that I recorded them over Skype, and they were inside a caboose that they are restoring. Very interesting conversation, as well as a review of the Rahway Valley History Volume 2 book of theirs. But before we get to that, I want to bring your attention to a blog post that I published to theroundhousepodcast.com about Train Festival 2011. Some of you will remember 5 years ago this major rail fanning event in Rock Island, Illinois, and I was there for it. It was such a fantastic event. So I do a retrospective article on what that was like with some photographs, and I'll have a link for you to check that out in the show notes of theroundhousepodcast.com. Our guests today are print media entrepreneurs of the new generation. They are Garbely Publishing, Rudy Garbely, who is the owner, editor-in-chief, and Richie King, who is author and editor. Please welcome these guys to the Roundhouse.
How's it going, Nick?
Hey.
Good to have both of you here with us today. How did you get started in writing about trains? We'll start with you, Rudy.
I wrote a couple articles as I was going through college. I actually majored in history, so I was always kind of writing something. So I was always writing articles. I wrote for Railpace and a couple other things. And then my college thesis was actually a 100-page research paper on the Lehigh Valley Railroad. So it kind of started there, and since then I've been doing a lot more of it, obviously, and opened a company.
And how about you, Richie?
I never had the intention of becoming an author. It just kind of ended up that way. I've always had an interest in the Rahway Valley Railroad. It ran through my hometown, so curiosity got the better of me in that way. I wondered about the abandoned tracks in my hometown. So I started accumulating information, doing some research, and one day I threw up a website, got several other people interested in my research. Rudy found me and approached me about doing a book about the Rahway Valley, and 2 books later, we're pretty good friends and got a lot of more books coming down the pike.
So, Rudy, what led you to founding your own publishing company, and what has that been like for you so far?
I wrote the Lehigh Valley book as my college thesis, and I got out of college, and I was sitting on this 100-page thesis with a bunch of photos I collected and everything else, and I wanted to get it published. And I looked around, and there really wasn't a publisher in the railroad realm, as far as we think of railroad publishers, that wanted to publish like a research paper. You know, this isn't your typical just kind of a photo book or photos with captions or whatever else. This is a major history, a major research undertaking, and all kinds of stuff like that. So I decided that I really wanted to get it published, and I decided to do it myself. So I opened my own company and I published my own book, and it kind of went from there. You know, since then I've written 3 more. I found Richie. Richie's written 2 books. Another author has done a couple of books on rare police badges. We have Gene Calora, who's done 2 books now of his photos. It's been a kind of interesting experience. The books have been received very differently by different crowds, and I've kind of seen the reason that other publishers didn't want to publish a research paper, because I've gotten everything from this is like the greatest thing ever, as far as actually having meaningful research published on railroads, to there aren't enough photos, I don't want to buy the book. So I've gotten really everything in that spread, everything in between, and it's been a good experience, though. I think we've been able to contribute a lot to what is written as far as actual written railroad history, and I think that's important. That's the kind of stuff that the people that that write the photo books are looking at 20, 30 years from now. They're looking at our research to figure out what the photos we're looking at are.
What is the process of having a book published, whether it be one that you've authored yourself or whether it's one that someone else has authored? Take us through the whole process from start to finish.
Well, I mean, whether it's one that I authored or somebody else, it starts with an idea. Somebody has an interest in a particular thing, whether it's me or Richie or somebody else, and says, I want to do a book on whatever the topic is, and kind of look around for what there is available for information. If you don't have any information, it's not really a viable book project. But if you've got enough stuff that you can put it in writing and get a book out of it, that's usually where I'll get a phone call or an email from somebody else saying, hey, I've got this topic that I want to write about, and I have this amount of information. Do you think you could do it as a book? At which point I'll look at it and say, well, can I sell it? I mean, obviously I enjoy railroad history and I enjoy doing it, but in the end, I've got to also be able to at least break even on it. So I have to look at it and say, do I have a market for this book? And that's something I've kind of learned over the past couple of years of doing this is what the market is, who the market is, and how I can sell certain things to certain people. So I'll look at that, and if assuming that, yes, there is a market for it, I'll go back and say, yeah, let's do this. And then from that point, I've had a couple different processes. It depends on who the person is. Some people will just send me all the material and say, here, put it together. Some people I'll work really closely with them. In the case of Richie or Gene Calora, work really closely with them about actually picking some of the content, scanning the photos, doing all that kind of on my end. I do all the photo editing in-house. We do all the formatting ourselves. Richie's done some of the formatting as well for his own books, but like for Gene Calora's books, I did everything formatting-wise. He sent me a bunch of negatives, and I gave him a book back. So we put the whole thing together. We go back and forth with the authors. They get full input on every bit of the process, as far as what they want to see in the book, how they want it written, how they want it formatted, everything like that. And when we finish that part, typically I'll order like a proof copy or a couple proof copies. We do our stuff usually, with a couple exceptions, print on demand. So I don't have to order a big run of books. I can do a handful at a time. So I can start off by ordering one copy and get it in and take a look at it and say, okay, this photo is too dark, this photo is too light. We need to revise the way this looks because it looks better on the screen than it did on paper. And once we got the revisions down and we got a proof copy that we're happy with, then we'll go ahead and produce the book. And that's based on demand. We'll do pre-orders usually to kind of gauge demand. And that's basically it. Then you end up with your book and it's out and it's getting read by other people.
Richie, how did you become connected with Rudy and embark on the journey of writing your first 2 books?
3 years ago, I threw a website up about the Rahway Valley, just what I had accumulated. And I started a Facebook page also, and started accumulating some people who were also interested, getting in touch with some former Rahway Valley employees. Meanwhile, Rudy was starting his company, his publishing company, and had gotten in touch with a gentleman who had worked for the Rahway Valley, who had a number of photos. And Rudy put up on his website that he was going to do a book about the Rahway Valley, which immediately piqued my interest because I said, who's this and what do they have? So Rudy actually reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to do a book rather than him, and kind of mushroomed from there. Kept contacting people, making contact with Rahway Valley employees, people with photos, fans of the railroad, and it all culminated in the 2 books that I've written.
For those who aren't familiar with the Rahway Valley Railroad, provide us an introduction as to what this short line was and what it was like, where it was located, things like that.
Okay. So the Rahway Valley Railroad was a short line. It operated in northern New Jersey for 95 years. The railroad only stretched for 11.8 miles, had connections with the Jersey Central, the Lehigh Valley, and the Lackawanna. The railroad played a very vital role in the development of the area which it served. The Rahway Valley hauled just about every commodity you could think of: coal, cement, lumber, bricks, pharmaceuticals, metal, resins, school supplies, food products, and you name it, the Rahway Valley hauled it. It not only spurred the growth of Union County and Essex County, the counties it served, but it literally hauled the materials that built the area. So it was a very folksy railroad, I like to call it. It only employed 25 people at maximum at any given time. So the people were very personable. They'd stop along the line. They'd give kids rides in the cab. They'd wait, kids would put pennies on the tracks. They knew the engines as the red one and the green one. So it was just a very folksy, down-to-earth, small railroad that was your hometown line.
Yeah, as I read the book, the Volume 2 History of the Line from 1951 to 2009, what struck me is how much character this railway had, especially when we're starting out with the 50s and 60s, talking about the general manager who was George Clark. He seemed like quite a character from all of the anecdotes you've included.
Yes, George Clark essentially was the Rahway Valley Railroad for 50 years. He started out as a kid growing up in Oregon. His dad managed a shortline railroad out there. And then in 1920, a friend of George Clark's father enticed them to come east and help him manage the Rahway Valley. Well, his friend up and left, and the Clarks were left to manage the railroad. So they got the railroad on its feet, and George Clark's father died, and George Clark took it over. George Clark had a certain way of doing things. He put pinup girls on calling cards that were given out to the customers. When an employee got fired, he'd write very nasty comments in the payroll ledger. He'd write instructions to the train crew, and he'd sign them Horatio P. Dingleberry. So he had a very larger-than-life character, which really made the Rahway Valley more than it was.
And it's clear from reading this that there were so many anecdotes and so much information that you were able to get, from photographs to stories from workers and family members of those who worked on the railroad. What was the process of taking all that information and distilling it into these books for a general audience?
The key, in my opinion, to write any history book is to let the book write itself. Unlike a fiction book, you're not inventing a story, you're recording history. The story's already there. So what I did was compile all the information I could find. Newspaper articles, stories from employees and family, annual reports, inspections, literally everything. I took all this information, I lumped it together in a big Word document and began sorting it chronologically. As you start to do that, the history begins to just piece itself together. You see the story coming out. If you can't take this information and put it into something that's palatable for people, you end up with a really dry and boring book. While it's interesting, it's presented in a boring way. I mean, how many railroad books start out on such and such date, several businessmen got together and chartered the such and such railroad. So, boiled down, all railroads have the same exact story. The goal for me is to extract from all those facts and figures is a real human story. At the end of the day, I don't want to tell a story of a locomotive and steel rails. I want to tell a story about people who built the railroad, who depended on the railroad, who made the railroad run every day. And I truly believe that I accomplished that in these two books.
So Richie finishes the book. Rudy, when you first read what he's put together, what are your feelings? What did you think of these two volumes and what he did assembled?
Well, actually, I saw them both at the same time because he'd been working on them, and then when he sent them over to me, he had the whole thing drafted, but he had all of it done. My first thought was information overload, followed by that he has a very unique take. And I'm seeing his stuff now. I'm finishing up my second book at the time that he was sending me the stuff for his first one. I know how I write. And I looked at how he wrote, and I was like, wow, he's blown me out of the water. It was a railroad that I was interested in. I mean, originally I was going to do my own book on it, and then I found him, and I figured he could do a better job than I did. And I was right about that. So it was a railroad that I had an interest in. I knew, I kind of knew the history, but I didn't know it the way he knew it, and I didn't know the way he wrote it. So I think, the way that his books are written are really a good testament to the character of the railroad, because I think the way he wrote them it's very fitting. It kind of, his writing style fits the whole aura of the Rahway Valley Railroad and the George Clark personality and everything else. Richie has a very personable way of writing, and I think it was a good read for me the first time through. And that's kind of when I knew it was going to be a very good book when we were done, because I hadn't even edited it at that point, nothing. I sat down and I read it. It was a good start. Very, very good start.
Now, here's something I'm curious about. You mentioned earlier that it's important when you're looking at these books as far as what you can sell, what is marketable. And I think a lot of people here are unfamiliar with the Rahway Valley, especially those who live outside of New Jersey or that general area. So how do you make a story like that appeal to people who've never heard the railway, where I think a lot of times in our hobby, people tend to stick with following the railroads that they know about? How do you introduce the Rahway Valley to new audiences?
Honestly, our best marketing, and with any real business, is word of mouth, I think. It spreads by somebody picks up this book and reads it and says, wow, this is a really cool story. And then they go find their friend who doesn't know anything about the Rahway Valley, and they're like, hey, you got to read this book. It's like, even if you don't like the Rahway Valley, you got to read this book. Not only do you gain readers that way, but you gain fans of the railroad. And that's kind of part of the goal of publishing a heavily researched written book versus just a photo book, is that you're not just looking at the railroad, you're kind of experiencing it. I think that's kind of what we sell. We sell not a slideshow in print form. We sell an experience. Whether you know anything about the Rahway Valley or not, when you get to the end of the book, you know about the Rahway Valley. Or whatever the topic is. Doesn't matter if it's Richie's books or mine or somebody else's. It's when you get to the end of the book, you have the knowledge on that railroad that you didn't need to have to read the book.
Something that made me smile when I was reading Volume 2 was that my beloved favorite railroad, the Shortline in New York that nobody knows, the Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville, does get a couple of mentions because of the... I have to look this up.
Bernie Cahill.
Thank you. Because Bernie Cahill used to work for the FJG before he came to the Rahway. So it's just a brief mention, but it did make me smile. And it emphasizes the point of how all of these short lines have always had an interwoven history and continue to in this day and age. You've also published books about the Morristown and Erie Railroad. Richie, what is your perspective on the family nature that short lines have, and why does that appeal to you?
Take a step back for a minute. Rudy wrote about the Morristown and Erie Railroad, and I wrote about the Rahway Valley Railroad. Both of our books start out talking about each other's railroad. So in the beginning of Rudy's book, his volume 2, it talks about how the representatives of the Morristown and Erie Railroad went down to the Rahway Valley to see their new diesel. And my book does vice versa. There's also an anecdote in there about how the Rahway Valley vied with the M&E every year to see who could eke out the bigger profit, just as a friendly competition. So as far as the relationship between the short lines goes, many of these guys worked for both these railroads, including and also the Raritan River, which is another New Jersey short line. We found a number of letters going back and forth between the Rahway Valley and the M&E of each other's company officials going to visit the other guys. As far as the whole family aspect on the railroad, family was everything to the Rahway Valley. I mean, it was owned by 3 generations of Lewis Keller's family. It was managed by 3 generations of the Clark family. There were 3 brothers, George Davis, Harry Davis, and Bob Davis, who all worked for the Rahway Valley. Carl Neese was the master mechanic of the Rahway Valley, and he'd bring his son there during the summer to work on the steam engines. His family was definitely a very important part of the Rahway Valley, and even if you weren't related to somebody who worked there, you felt like you were part of that family. Even if you were just a kid who rode your bike to the Rahway Valley after school to go see the engine in the engine house, George Davis would come out and say, "Sure, kid, I'll come show you the engine." And we find countless stories like that of the Rahway Valley catering to kids, showing them the engines, giving them rides.
Yeah, caboose rides,
engine rides. Sometimes the kids ran the engines. So family was played an important role on the Rahway Valley.
And how about you, Rudy?
Yeah, the M&E is kind of almost the same thing. It was owned by the McEwen family for the first 50 or so years of its existence. It was managed by the McEwen family and its descendants for about the first 70-something years, 75. It was, and then after that, it was managed by the same owners for the last 35 years or so. It very much has the same kind of feeling as the Rahway Valley. People, I still get emails from people that read the books, and I remember that railroad from when I stopped by there in 1965, and the mechanic took me for a tour of the shop, or something like that. It's a very different animal than like a Class 1. Like if the book I wrote on the Lehigh Valley Railroad doesn't have that kind of family feeling to it. And I mean, there were instances of that, but it wasn't a corporate culture like it was on a Shortline railroad. And I think that's what makes the Shortline stories that we put out much more compelling.
In terms of how you've chosen to put these stories out, Rudy, you're choosing print. And we constantly hear messages about print dying, which I think are being tempered more than they have been in the past, because obviously there's still a thriving publishing industry out there. But where so many publications turn their focus to blogging or online content, why is it that you choose traditional paper?
There's a number of reasons. I mean, one would be, we're preserving history, and it kind of just feels right to do that in a historically traditional method. If we're going to sit there, we're going to pour through a bunch of books and paperwork and archives and all kinds of moldy boxes full of stuff, I kind of want to put something out at the end of it that can be added to that. We're adding to the historical record. I think that's far more difficult to do in a blog or online or even like an ebook. I think it's not a tangible record at that point. It's just kind of an idea. It's a thing you can see on a screen. It's not something you can hold in your hand, but I think if you're looking at history, it's something you kind of want. The other main reason, I guess, is that the digital methods are kind of really in a state of development and fluctuation right now. For instance, last year, 2014, the ebook usage was about 32% of readers were reading ebooks, and last year it went down to 19%. It's been all over the map. So, which kind of proves there hasn't been something that replaced the print publication yet. I don't think there's ever really going to be. There's 2,000 years of written history on a piece of paper. I don't think anyone's ever going to change that. And and we do tend to have an older crowd, which is just part of the railroading hobby at this point. But again, I don't think that having a print book is going to turn away the younger crowd. I don't think anybody's going to ever look at a print book and say, I don't want that. If I only want it if it's an ebook. I think for now it's both safe, and I think it's our preference, really, for what we want to do with our materials and our research.
I'm sure that for you, Richie, when you completed these volumes and you completed the editing process and you were finally able to hold the actual physical copies of these, that had an important meaning to you. What's your take on what it means to be writing content that is physical?
Well, like Rudy said, the tangibility factor is very important to us. For all intents and purposes, the Rahway Valley is gone. You can't go down to the Kenilworth station and watch the train go by. To be able to have the Rahway Valley literally in your hands and thumb through the pages of its history is very important. I believe that online content, while it can be informative and, at your fingertips, it gets watered down and it loses its meaning. Being able to sit down at your chair and lean back and read a good story, I believe, is very important to me, and it's important to other people. As far as having something tangible that I created, it's a very gratifying feeling to see something come to fruition, because we developed all of these books on the computer. So to sit there in front of the computer for 4 or 5 hours a day putting these books together, and then finally seeing it in your hands, it's a wonderful feeling to see something come full circle.
You talk about how the audience for these historic publications, these preservations of lines past and railroading past, tends to have an older audience. When you look at future projects you'd like to do, and you consider that what is now the present will eventually be a past, how do you envision in capturing that present in a way that can appeal to the younger generation, especially where there is so much content on modern day class ones in particular? Or is that something that you feel like you're always going to be looking to explore these niche stories of short lines? We'll start with you, Rudy.
We've done some recent stuff. I mean, I wrote for a couple articles for Rail Pace. I mean, that's as bad as present as you're going to get, written, in print railroad history. I enjoy looking back to the things that I don't remember myself. That being said, I've also done a lot to try to preserve what I can of, that I come across from present day. I take a lot of photos. Anytime I come across some kind of railroad document that I think will be useful in the future, I keep it. I have filing cabinets full, literally several filing cabinets full of filed railroad paperwork from 1890 something to present. And I just keep it because I never know if even if it's not me, if it's somebody else, another publishing company that needs a 2014 Norfolk Southern report to stockholders, well, I have one, and they're welcome to it. I think that's important as well, is looking at, what we're living through now as future history. While it's not the focus of my current research, it's definitely in the back of my mind that eventually somebody's going to come up and ask me questions about a book they want to write. And I need to have a way to remember and record what I'm doing now so that I have something to give them in 20, 30, 40 years.
And for you, Richie, as you look at future topics that you want to write about, what are the things that are most compelling to you?
Well, going back to your question about the older and younger crowds, the older crowd buys the books because they remember it, and it's kind of a photo album of their memories of these railroads. For me, the Rahway Valley ceased to exist 2 years before I was even born. So I literally had to recreate the entire railroad in my head for it to come out on print. With that being the case, I believe it's not that hard to capture the interest of the younger generation as far as rail history goes. I've given a number of presentations where, young kids come up to me and say, I love trains, this railroad is in my backyard and I want to know more about it. And, their parents buy them the book, and it's really a good feeling to see that the story is going to survive. As far as what's compelling to me, present day railroading does not interest me in the slightest. Rudy will tell you, we go to little short lines and tourist operations to see the 1937 SW engine burbling away. Seeing New Jersey Transit go by all day doesn't capture our interest. To find something that's interesting to me, I have to go back in time or find that little hole-in-the-wall railroad that has that little SW chugging away. So yeah, that's what's compelling to me.
It's funny that you say that you had to recreate the railroad in your head, because as I've been reading the book, the thought I kept having in my head is, I really want somebody to build the Rahway Valley line for a train simulator, because then I could understand even better how these different locations relate to each other, the traffic flow, the major operational headache that was the Route 22 intersection railroad crossing with that road. I feel like that would give an interesting dimension to it as well, in compliments to the stories that you're providing here.
It's gotten to the point where I can literally look at any Rahway Valley photo and tell you where it was taken, what they're doing, and what year it is. It's literally gotten to that point. As far as operations and track maps, that's going to be a project coming down the pike. I have enough information to do a map of every section of the Rahway Valley every decade from start to finish. I have a conductor that worked for the Rahway Valley who could tell you how many ties probably were on the Rahway Valley, or what, if he looked at a picture of a boxcar, he could tell you what customer it was going to. So he knows operationally how that all worked, and it's very interesting how it all worked. So that'll be another book coming down the line to tell you, okay, we told you the history of the Rahway Valley, but here's how it worked. Here's what the guys did every day, and this is the customers, what they got, and what cars they came in. So for a model railroader, that's gold to see how a railroad works and what it does.
Rudy, as I'm looking at your publishing company's website, there's a very nice section of books that you have coming soon, and these are books that you're authoring and books that others are authoring. Why don't you walk us through some of the publications that you have planned for this year and next year?
Well, actually, there's a few that aren't on there. I'm actually working on a book right now for the Tri-State Railway Historical Society. We're actually going to reprint one of their books that came out in the 80s. That will probably be the next book that comes out because it's, as of last night, done. So that'll be kind of not a surprise announcement, but it's just not on the website yet. We're also doing a book for the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. Same thing, we're reprinting one of the books that came out in the early 80s. That'll be out later this year. As far as then books that we're doing for ourselves, probably the next one of those to come out will be the book I'm doing on Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is actually a collection of photos that were taken by one of my good friend's grandfathers just prior to World War II around Oklahoma. And there's a few other photos from other locations that he traveled to around that time period. They're not the greatest photos in the world, but because there's somebody that had a camera in Oklahoma during the Depression, it's a collection of photos that's really, really rare. And there's not a whole lot of them either, but it's enough that I felt they should be printed and seen. So that's probably going to be the next one. It's laid out. I got to finish the caption. That's about ready to go. Richie's working on a book on the Aldine, New Jersey area and all the railroads that served it. That was the crossroads between the CNJ and the Lehigh Valley, where there was also an interchange with the Rahway Valley and the Baltimore, Ohio / Staten Island Rapid Transit there. The Reading came through there on the CNJ and the B&O. It was a big mess of railroads in there and within about 1 square mile. So Richie's going to do a whole book on that, which I guess hasn't made it too far beyond a collection of information at this point.
Yes, I'm busily working on a caboose, so the book writing has been put on hold for a little bit.
Yeah, well, same here. That's kind of what we're doing. I'm doing a couple contract things this summer because I'm doing the caboose too. So I've got my volume 3 on the Mars Head and Erie. It's coming kind of slowly. It's been my back burner project for like 2 years now. So as I get time, I'm kind of getting stuff together for it. I've also got a new author. His name is Paul Strubeck. He's going to be coming out with 4 books in a series on railroad marine freight operations around New York Harbor. First one he's doing is going to be on diesel tugboats. I think then he's going to do steam tugboats, and then he's doing 2 on the car float operations themselves. One on the major railroads and one on the terminal and like minor railroads around the New York Harbor area. Paul is actually a crewman on the restored Lehigh Valley Railroad Cornell, which is a functioning for-hire tugboat around the New York Harbor area up the Hudson River. He's got a wealth of information. We've got more photos and documents than we even know what to do with at this point, which is why it went from being 1 book to 4. I'm expecting that his one on diesel tugboats will be out sometime towards the end of this year. And then there's actually another one that's not announced yet that'll be out probably late summer. That's being done with part of the Newberry Library's collection of CB&Q photos that were professionally taken in the mid to late 40s. to be called Granger Country. It's going to be an author named Jim Reisdorf. Jim is actually the owner of South Platte Press. He and I have been collaborating on this for about 6 months now. So that'll see the light of day sometime towards the end of the summer as well. And then there's a couple other books on there that are more long-term projects. There's a couple more books on Rare Police Badges that'll be out either late this year or early next year that haven't really been started yet. There's a few other things on there as well, but we're busy. There's a lot of stuff going on. And in addition to doing all of that, we're also restoring a caboose this summer. It's been a lot, but there's a lot of cool stuff coming in the pipeline.
Yes, as a matter of fact, right now as we're recording this interview, you're in the caboose. Richie, tell us about this project that you've been working on that's kept you from the writing, but sounds very exciting in its own right.
So Rudy, myself, and our other friend Kevin, who also does some work for the publishing company, we're members of the Tri-State Railway Historical Society, which is a chapter of the NRHS. And Tri-State owns four cabooses as well as a F3 that's up at Steamtown. So and a baggage car. So the Erie caboose, the C330, is the last caboose to be restored. So being the young guns of the group, we've been tasked with restoring it. Rudy, Kevin, and I have experience in restoring full-size railroad equipment. We cosmetically restored the Rahway Valley's 270-tonners. We also did some work for the Morristown and Erie Railway, painting their number 23 engine. So now we've moved to rolling stock.
So the goal is to have the caboose restored. The United Railroad Historical Society in New Jersey is having a big open house here in Boonton, and I think it's September 25th this year, whatever that Sunday is. So the goal is to have the caboose done by that, or at least the exterior. I don't know if the interior is going to get done by then, but the exterior will be done. And we're doing a professional job on it, so we're going to looks like we're going to end up sandblasting the whole caboose, and we're going to do a full professional paint job on it, painted lettering. It'll be like a good 20-25 year paint job on it. So we've been doing this for the past couple months. We got a couple more months of work to go on it yet.
Starting with you, Rudy, when you look at everything you've accomplished, both in terms of the railroad preservation you're doing with this caboose and with the Tri-State Railway Historical Society, as well as your publishing company, what makes you the most happy about the work that you're doing and looking forward towards goals of the future?
I guess, my big thing in doing all of this is that in 20, 30, 40 years or whatever, the stuff that I'm interested in and the stuff that I'm doing and preservation-wise, writing-wise, everything is still going to be here. And I can kind of, as the interest bit me, I'm offering that opportunity to somebody else. Somebody else can pick up my book and get interested in the Morristown and Erie. Somebody else can come up and look at this caboose that we're repainting and be interested in this caboose and the history that it holds and the history it's part of. So I think it's very important for me to be able to pass along the same experiences that I was able to have because the Morristown area was there and this caboose was here and everything else to another generation and keep it alive and make sure that the things that I'm interested in don't kind of die with me.
And how about for you, Richie?
Obviously, my big passion is the Rahway Valley, and that went away 2 years before I was born. There's not a lot left, so keeping that around is important to me, as well as all this other equipment that's in New Jersey that has been forlorn and neglected for many years. To carry this on to the next generation and even our own generation is very important to me because that's what's going to keep this stuff around. I feel like rail preservation is kind of lost on our generation. The generation before us, experienced Conrail and all that, and, they lost all those fallen flags that were important to them. They started preserving and, collecting cabooses and freight cars and engines and things. What's going to happen to that stuff when they're all gone? So I believe it's important to inspire our generation and the coming generations to the fact that this stuff is important and it means something to our history as far as New Jersey goes, the United States, that we ought to keep this stuff around as a testament to our past.
That's certainly a good way of looking at it. And I think that the work that you guys are doing is an important step in that process. And being able to see that you can do it. I mean, when you guys when I saw that you guys were my age, and here you have a publishing company and you're writing books. That's pretty cool. That's pretty inspiring for a guy like me to look at that and be like, oh, that's taking an interesting direction and showing the older generation that we care and showing the younger generation that we can. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here on the Roundhouse today. And it's been really interesting to hear about your perspective in the world of publishing, and looking forward to reading future books of yours. You guys have got a great start.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Nick. It was a pleasure talking to you.
So when Richie and Rudy reached out to me about appearing on the Roundhouse, I asked if they could send me a copy of one of their books to get a better sense of the type of product that they offer. And so they sent me a copy of the Rahway Valley, Volume 2, Just a Shortline, the history of the line from 1951 to 2009. I'd never heard of the Rahway Valley before meeting these guys and coming across these books. I'm not a New Jersey Rail fan, and even so, the Rahway Valley was a very small short line as things are concerned. But I gave it a read, and this is a very interesting book. Some of the pros of this book: the print quality on this is excellent. The photos are nicely presented. The text is easy to read. You have a nice assortment of what's included as well. Not just photos, you have maps showcasing the line so you can understand when Richie is sharing these anecdotes where things are taking place on the system. You have also little notes that have been scanned from employees of the Rahway Valley that give you a sense of that personality that Richie was talking about during the episode. And I feel like the personality is easily this book's number one strength. It feels complete, not just because it's chronicling the history from 1951 to 2009, but because it captures the heart of the railroad, its employees, and this community. George Clark in particular, early on in the book, is quite the character, and that spunk definitely gives this a unique vibe, even in terms of shortline history. That's part of what makes this compelling. My creative producer for the Roundhouse, Bethany, read the beginning of this book and was hooked because you don't have to be a rail fan to be connected to the history of this, to the heart of this, and the character of it. And I think that's one of the book's biggest strengths. So even if you haven't heard of the Rahway Valley, that alone makes it worth checking out. And because Richie is so passionate about the subject, you get that passion. You get the passion from him in terms of his writing style, and you get it from the anecdotes that he shares from those who are connected with the railway. And that is really gratifying to read. If there were any cons about the book, the only thing I would say is that if you haven't read Volume 1, which is the first half of the railway's history, then it takes a little while to become oriented with the railroad. There's no sort of recap last night on the Rahway Valley type of introduction. You're right there in 1951 when they're dieselizing. So it could take a little while to get your bearings in terms of what the Rahway Valley is if you haven't read Volume 1. But that said, within the first few pages, you get a sense of the tone we're going for in the book. You have a sense of the direction it's going to go. And I certainly don't think that reading Volume 1 is a requirement for reading Volume 2. Overall, this is a fantastic book, and I appreciate Garbly Publishing for sending me a copy to review here on the Roundhouse, and I'll have a link in the show notes if you want to buy yourself a copy. This is a book definitely worth checking out, even if you've never heard of this railroad before.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we talked with Tom Davis, who's the innkeeper at the Station Inn in Crescent, Pennsylvania, about what it's like to operate a railfan bed and breakfast. And to go with that, I asked you guys, what is your favorite memory of staying in a hotel or bed and breakfast while railfanning? Here's a couple of responses I want to share with you. First, from Aiden Nyes. I was staying at the Bridge View in Marysville, PA, on the eastern end of the Pittsburgh line, and at about 6:30 we were awoken by an engine blasting its horn for some people on the bridge. Though that was a bad reason to signal, it was cool in my eyes, or ears, I should say. This from Zach Reitmeyer. It's a cookie cutter for sure, but the Holiday Inn, Cumberland, Maryland, is a favorite of mine. I was attracted to stay there while visiting the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad by negative comments on the hotel's site, saying things like, quote, never stay at a place next to a railroad, and, quote, it's a great place if you like to be woken up by trains at all hours of the night. Sounds good to me. The hotel has offered railfan packages in the past that include a room overlooking the Amtrak station and CSX yard, breakfast at a reserved window table, and 2 tickets to ride Western Maryland Scenic Railroad's Mountain Thunder. I usually walk from the hotel to the station, which is separated by Cumberland's gorgeous downtown shopping district. And yes, there is a hobby shop there. Wow, what a fantastic place, Zach. And we did interview John Garner from the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad about what makes their operation so unique. That's definitely a place I want to go in the near future. Your question of the day for this week is, what is your favorite railroad book? Let me know in the comments on the roundhousepodcast.com or via social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can follow us there and keep this conversation going. And I do enjoy so much being able to have this conversation with you guys. I hope you have fun with it too. It is such an interesting thing that we're doing here. We're coming up on 50 episodes. 50. And I've got a couple of neat surprises in store that you'll be hearing about very soon. But I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode and to being part of the Roundhouse. The Roundhouse truly is our house, and you make that happen. If you like this episode, share it with somebody online or someone in person. That's how we get to do more, and that's how we get to gather even more compelling and fascinating stories. Thank you guys, and remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.